Hi, I want you to first attempt this question before you look at what I have to say about this question. So just pause this video, take 2, 3, 4, 5, whatever minutes you need to solve this question, and then after having solved this question, then you can continue. Okay, let me start. So I'll start with the passage. So it says, if the airspace around centrally located airports, if this airspace around the specific airports were restricted to commercial, why does it say were? So it's using were because it's talking about a hypothetical scenario. Right? It's not really talking about past, it's talking about a hypothetical scenario. So if these airports were restricted, or not if these airports, the airspace around these airports were restricted to commercial airliners, so we are allowing commercial airliners, and only those private planes equipped with radar. So you are restricting to commercial and only those private ones which are equipped with radar. So then what are we not allowing? We are not allowing the private planes not equipped with a radar, right? Because we are allowing all commercial airliners, and we are also allowing private planes equipped with radar. So the only thing that we are not allowing is private planes not equipped with radar. And then it says if this is done, most of the private plane traffic would be forced to use outlying airfields. Okay, so let's spend some time here. So if we restrict in this way, so again, as we discussed, what we are not allowing is only the private planes not equipped with radar, right? We are allowing private planes equipped with radar. We are also allowing all commercial airliners. And then it's saying that if this were done, most of the private plane traffic would be forced to use outlying airfields. So what this argument is thinking or assuming is that most of the private plane traffic comes from private planes not equipped with radar, right? Because we are saying if we don't allow these planes, which is private planes not equipped with radar, then most of the traffic would be forced to use outlying airfields. So they will not be able to use the airspace around centrally located airports. Right? So this is definitely one of the assumptions. Any other thing that the argument is assuming at this stage? If we don't allow the private planes not equipped with radar, that's the essence. Most of the traffic would be forced to use outlying airfields. What if the private planes, which are right now not equipped with radar, they also install radars once you have these restrictions in place, right? So it is possible, right? Or that, let's say, not many private planes currently not equipped with radar will get themselves equipped with radar once the restrictions come into force, right? That can happen. That, let's say, it could happen that they currently don't have radars, but once you have these restrictions that okay, we'll allow only private planes with radar, they may also end up installing radar. So then most of the private plane traffic would not be forced to use outlying airfields. right? Now let's consider some variations of this statement. Let's say if it were not private plane traffic, it were just traffic, then what would be the assumption? In this case, the assumption was that most of the private plane traffic comes from private planes not equipped with radar, right? Now we are saying in this case we are restricting, or we are essentially not allowing, right? This is essentially about not allowing private planes which do not have radar, and then we are saying most of the plane traffic, right? In this case, I believe the assumption is most of the plane traffic comes from same thing. So in this case, we are talking about the most of the plane traffic in general, not just private plane traffic, in general, including commercial also. That comes from private planes not equipped with radar, because we are not allowing private planes not equipped with radar, and then we are saying most of the plane traffic would be forced to use outlying airfields, right? Let's create another variation. Let's say if it were some instead of most, then the assumption would be some of the private plane traffic comes from private planes not equipped with radar, right? Okay, I'll not explain this. I think possibly if you just relate, you will make sense of it. And let's again create another variation. Let's say if it were all, then you can understand possibly, given what we have been doing, the assumption in this case will be all of the private plane traffic comes from private planes not equipped with radar. Essentially in this case, I can also rewrite this as none of the private plane traffic comes from private planes equipped with radar. Essentially we are saying these private planes equipped with radar do not contribute to any traffic, because once we do not allow private planes not equipped with radar, all of the private plane traffic would be forced to use outlying airfields. Now let's do something. Let me ask you a little tricky question. Okay, I'm already qualifying as tricky. I'm not sure whether you're going to get biased now. So my question is, let me write a statement. Let me write this as a statement. Is this an assumption? This is the question for you. Of the above argument. What do I mean by above argument? I mean this argument in which I am talking about all. Is this an assumption of the above argument? So take your time. You can pause this video at this stage. Take your time. Come back to this video once you have the answer. Okay. So yeah, this is an assumption. I'm not sure what you thought. You might have thought this is not an assumption, but this is also an assumption. Yes, this is an assumption. Okay. Why this is an assumption? Let's talk about it. What does most mean? First of all, most means a majority, more than 50%, right? If you look at the argument structure here, essentially the argument is, if we do not allow private planes not equipped with radar, right? Basically we are restricting to only private planes equipped with radar, so we are not allowing private planes not equipped with radar. We are saying all of the private plane traffic would be forced to use outlying airfields, right? So it's clear that we are thinking that all of the private plane traffic comes from private planes not equipped with radar, right? But since that is the assumption, what is also assumed is most of the traffic comes from such planes. Because if I am assuming all, I am also assuming most. Let me explain how. Let's create a simple example. Let's say if I say CJ is a man, therefore CJ is biased, let's say. Okay, what is the assumption here? All men are biased, right? Why is this an assumption? Because if I negate it, negation will be not all men are biased. If this is the case, this will break down the argument, because if not all men are biased, we cannot say that CJ is biased, right? Basically, assumption is something whose negation breaks down the argument, right? Now let's look at this statement. Most men are biased. What will be the negation of this? 50% or fewer men are biased, right? If 50% or fewer men are biased and CJ is a man, can we say CJ is biased? No. In this case also we cannot say. This will also break down the argument, right? You get that? Okay. In general, if this is an assumption, anything that is a subset of it, now this is a term that can be misunderstood by a lot of you. I'm using it in a specific way, that all men are biased, so most men are biased in that way, that most more than 50, if all is the case, then more than 50 will also be the case. Okay, right? Or there's another way I'm thinking to say this. Basically, all inferences from it will also be assumptions, because if all men are biased, then definitely most men are also biased, right? If 100% of men are biased, then more than 50% are also biased. Some men are biased, this will also be an assumption. This is always the case. Okay, I can frame it like this, that if something is an assumption, all inferences from that will also be assumptions. Okay, this is always the case. So here, since the assumption is all of the private plane traffic comes from these planes, most of the private plane traffic Sorry. Okay, I made a mistake. Very good. This can happen if you're doing something live. Sorry for that. But this this will be an assumption. Okay, not the plane traffic, but the private plane traffic. I'm sorry for the confusion. This will be an assumption. Okay, because all is an assumption, so most will also be an assumption. Similarly, with the same logic, some will also be an assumption. This will also be an assumption. Okay. If you have any questions, then I think you might have a lot of questions. You can feel free to ask in the comments. So yeah, but this is one of the concepts which people are just not aware of. So yeah, so these are also assumptions. Now coming back to this, yeah. So let me go here, or let me create another one. Okay, so yeah. So if the airspace around these airports were restricted to commercial airliners, and so essentially we are excluding the planes, private planes not equipped with the radar, then we are saying most of the private plane traffic would be forced to use outlying airfields. And as we discussed, it could happen that we are assuming that most of the private plane traffic comes from such planes which we are excluding, and we are also assuming that whatever private planes that are not equipped with radar are not going to get equipped with radar once we have these restrictions in place, right? Okay, and then it says, so this first of all, another thing to observe is this is definitely a claim, because the author is talking about a hypothetical scenario. It's not really a fact, right? So this can be challenged, and in the official question, the assumption is inbuilt in the first statement. Okay. We are going to discuss the original question also. Right now I'm just talking about the passage and massaging it and looking at it in various ways. Such a reduction in the amount of private plane traffic. Okay, so such reduction that most of the private plane traffic is out. This reduction in the amount of private plane traffic would reduce the risk of mid-air collision around the centrally located airports. So let me ask you a couple of things. I want you to what will be the impact of the following statements, or let's say I'll show you the statements one by one. So impact means strengthen, weaken, or no impact. Okay, that's what we have to think. Strengthen or weaken or no impact. So the first statement is, if you make this shift, okay, let me write it down here. The given restrictions on the airspace around centrally located airports will lead to significantly greater number of collisions on the runways of the airports. So essentially, we are not allowing them in the airspace and all that, right? But let's say I talk about that if you have these restrictions in place, this will lead to a significantly greater number of collisions. So right now, whatever collisions we have on the runways, right? There are some collisions in the air and there are some collisions could be on the runways also. So right now I'm talking about, let's say if this restrictions, if you have these in place, then that will lead to significantly greater number of collisions on the runways of the airports. What will be the impact of this? Strengthen, weaken, or no impact? So again, pause this video, think about it, come back to this video. You can unpause this video once you have the answer. Okay, so the answer is this statement has no impact on the argument. Why? Because the argument is this reduction in private plane traffic would reduce the risk of mid-air collision. So we are not concerned with the risk of collisions on the runways because that's not mid-air. Right now you may be thinking, oh, this is such nonsense, right? Why would we be not concerned about the risk of collisions on the runways, right? That doesn't make any sense. In any case, there are collisions, the lives are being lost and whatever, right? So how can we become so narrow that we are not even taking this into account? The point is not that we are narrow or not narrow. The point is we are looking at the impact of the statement on the argument. I'm not asking you to look at the statement and you decide now whether you're going to have these restrictions in place or not. No, that's not the question asked from you. The question asked from you is, what is the impact of this statement on the argument? The argument is this reduction would reduce the risk of mid-air collision. That's what the argument is. So now in this case it does not matter whether it leads to more collisions on the runways. That has absolutely zero impact. Okay, on this statement that it would reduce the risk of mid-air collision. Again, you have to clear what the question is asking from you. The question is not asking you to evaluate whether you would like to have these restrictions in place. That's what people start thinking. The question is specific. What is the impact of the statement on the argument? And the argument is just that this will reduce the risk of mid-air collision. So on this argument, which is just talking about the risk of mid-air collision, the risk of collision on the runway has no impact. Okay, so this statement has absolutely no impact. If I change the argument and I make it would reduce the risk of collision, and then I ask you, okay, tell me what is the impact of this statement. Now this is a weakener. Okay. How does it weaken? Because if there are a lot of collisions on the runway, so the overall risk of collision has not really come down, right? So just I change the word there, if I remove that word from here, it suddenly has an impact, right? So now you may think, oh, I have to pay attention to all these words. Yes, of course, right? Everything is written there, right? So whatever is written is what you're supposed to pay attention to. This is how things are, right? So again, going back to the original one, let me ask you another question. Quite likely you will get it right. Let's say I make a similar statement that the given restrictions will lead to a significantly greater number of collisions. Now let me specifically talk about mid-air collisions. In the outlying airfields. Right, so the restrictions are you are essentially going to reduce the collisions around the centrally located airports because you have traffic come on, right? You're not allowing certain planes. But what if this leads to more mid-air collisions in the outlying airfields? What will be the impact of this statement on the above argument? So again, pause this video, think about it, come back to it once you have the answer. this statement has no impact, just as the above statement had, because the argument is specific to the risk of mid-air collision around the centrally located airports. So we are not concerned with the risk of mid-air collision in the outlying airfields. Again, you may have an Hanjo, but if there are a lot of collisions there, then what's the point of these restrictions? Again, the question asked from you is not whether you would like to have the restriction. The question asked from you is, what is the impact of this statement on the argument? The argument is, these restriction, this will lead to this reduction will lead to reduction in the mid-air collision around the centrally located airports. Now, whether this leads to higher risk of collision around other airports, which are, let's say, outlying airfields, that has no impact on the argument. Okay, the question again asked from you is, what is the impact on the argument? So you have to really go by the argument. If the argument is specific to centrally located airports, then your scope is limited to that. Similarly, again, if I bring a change here, if I, instead of this risk of mid-air collision, in general I say around the airports in general, then in this case this statement becomes a weakener. Because now in this case we have a reason to believe that this will not reduce the risk of mid-air collision around the airports, because out in the outlying airfields, so airports in the outside, sort of outside the city, or which are not centrally located, we have a higher risk of mid-air collision, right? In that case, this will weaken. Okay. So yeah, this is massaging the argument here. Now let's go back to the original question. Okay, so the conclusion drawn in the first sentence, so the question is specific to the conclusion drawn in the first sentence, so we're just concerned with this, depends on which of the following assumptions. So let's go one by one. Outlying airfields, so right, so we talked about that most of the private plane traffic would be forced to use outlying airfields. So we are talking about those outlying airfields would be as convenient as centrally located airports for most pilots of private planes. So the first thing to evaluate while you are evaluating an option is to understand the option in itself, just the meaning of the option, which is where a lot of people falter. Okay, they start connecting, they start evaluating even before they have really understood the meaning. So this is the first thing, that you first understand the meaning. The meaning of the statement is, it's really talking about the convenience, how convenient it is for most pilots of private planes. So it's saying outlying airfields would be as convenient as the centrally located airports, right? So they are equally convenient for most pilots of private planes. Okay, so if they are equally convenient, what we are talking about is that now we are talking about shifting the traffic to outlying airfields. So these pilots of private airplanes would not face inconvenience if they are equally convenient, right? If the outlying airfields are equally convenient, then these pilots, essentially we can say that these most pilots would not face inconvenience because of these restrictions, right? But now try to think, and we have to focus on the first statement. Is the convenience of the pilots relevant to this argument? We are talking about that if we don't allow private planes not equipped with radar, most of the private plane traffic would be forced to use outlying airfields. That's what the point is. Now, whether it's going to be as convenient or less convenient or more convenient to pilots. How does that matter? Let's say, let me make it a little extreme. Let's say, let me create a scenario in which would be much less convenient than. So let's create this scenario, which some of you might be thinking of. Let's say if outlying airfields are really much less convenient, so it's really hard for these most pilots of private airplanes to use those outlying airfields than centrally located airports. Okay, so now because of the restrictions, it's going to be really inconvenient for most pilots of private planes. So now what? Wouldn't still most of the traffic would be forced to use outlying airfields, right? That would still be the case. It's not that right? Once you have the restrictions in place, there is no option for them to really come here. Right? Now, if you are thinking, oh, but if it is so inconvenient for them to go to outlying airfields, they may try to use the centrally located airports. No, so the restrictions are there, right? So it means that planes that are not equipped with radar, they cannot use the centrally located airports anymore. So doesn't matter how much less convenient it is for them, they still need to use outlying airfields. So whether it's as convenient, less convenient, more convenient for most pilots of private planes, that has no relevance to the argument, to the first statement. Okay, so this has absolutely no impact. Okay, so now let's look at the second one. Most outlying airfields are not equipped to handle commercial airline traffic. So one thing that clearly stands out is it is talking about commercial airline traffic. If you look at the argument, which is the first statement for us, right, because we are talking about the conclusion drawn in the first sentence depends on which of the following elements, so we are restricted to the first statement. We are talking about moving the private plane traffic, right? In any case, we are allowing commercial airliners to the centrally located airports. We are just talking about moving some of the private plane traffic, which is essentially the private planes which are not equipped with radar. Now, whether these airfields are equipped to handle commercial airline traffic, that has completely zero relevance, right? Now let me change it to private plane traffic. Now what is the impact? Most outlying airfields are not equipped to handle private plane traffic, so they cannot handle private plane traffic. Now what's going to happen? Our argument was that we are not going to allow private planes not equipped with radar, and because of that, most of the private plane traffic would be forced to use, because they cannot come to centrally located airport, they will be forced to use outlying airfields. Now we are seeing most outlying airfields, by the way, are not equipped to handle private plane traffic. Then in that case, it's saying most, it's more than 50%. So then whatever remaining outlying airfields, whichever, right, they can handle private plane traffic. So most cannot handle private plane traffic, we are saying. But then whatever can handle the private plane traffic will have to go to those airfields, right? Because in any case, we are not allowing them. Right? So what we need to keep in mind is that restriction is there that we are not going to allow private planes not equipped with radar. Right? It's not that, okay, the outlying cannot handle it, so you come here. No, we are saying we are restricting them. So you cannot entertain that possibility, because otherwise there is no restriction on private planes not equipped with radar. So even this will have no impact. If most outlying airfields that are not equipped to handle private plane traffic, the private plane traffic which is not allowed anymore will have to use the remaining outlying airfields, but sort of whoever can handle private plane traffic. Now let's create an even more extreme version of this, and let's say all outlying airfields are not equipped to handle. So let's say, which essentially means none of the outlying airfields are equipped to handle private plane traffic. So outlying airfield cannot handle private plane traffic. Okay, so none of them can handle now. What is the impact? In this case, most of the private plane traffic would be forced to use outlying airfields, and now we are saying no outlying airfield can handle private plane traffic. So it's a very tricky situation. They'll be forced to use, because they are not allowed in the centrally located airports. So they'll be forced to use this, but this cannot handle it. So in that case, where will traffic go? Right? They cannot use centrally located. They'll have to go to outlying airfield, but the outlying airfields cannot handle them. They are not equipped to handle. So they would be forced to use outlying airfields. Well, in that case, what is the option before the private plane traffic? Either that traffic would disappear, right? So the private planes which are not equipped with radar will have to stop operating at all, because they are not allowed around centrally located airports, and now the outlying airfields cannot handle them. So either they will disappear, or they'll have to somehow use outlying airfields even though they are not equipped to handle them. I don't know how that can how that can happen. But essentially we are arriving at that kind of situation, which is a kind of a weird situation in which they cannot use a centrally located, they'll have to use outlying, but then outlying are not equipped to handle them. So right, so now this is a slightly tricky situation, which is it'll seem to sort of make the situation a little difficult to imagine. But till here, the statement option has no impact. Okay, even if I change commercial airline to private plane traffic. Okay, so let's look at C now, and let me bring it to the top so that we have the argument visible. So it says most private planes that use centrally located airports are not equipped with radar, right? Which is the assumption, because we are saying if we don't allow the private planes not equipped with radar, most of the traffic would be forced to use outlying airfields, right? So definitely we are assuming that most of the planes most of the private planes are not equipped with radar. That's why most of the traffic would be forced to use outlying airfields. Okay, so building on what we discussed, let's say if it were, let me create a variation of it, C1, some private planes that use are not equipped with radar, even this will be an assumption. Rather, as I said, any inference that comes out of this will be an assumption, so you can create any version, C2. So if most means more than 50%, so some will definitely be true. Or you can say this will also be an assumption. Of course, you will not have two correct assumptions in an official CR question. Okay, but I'm just saying for our discussion sake, these will also be assumptions. Okay, now let's look at D. Okay, commercial airliners are at greater risk of becoming involved in mid-air collisions than our private planes. So first of all, what is the meaning of this statement? It's comparing commercial airliners and private planes, and it's really talking about who is at greater risk of being in a mid-air collision. So it's saying commercial airliners are actually at a greater risk, right? So what does that mean? So if you want to really reduce mid-air collisions, it makes sense to not have commercial airliners rather than not have private planes, because commercial airliners are at greater risk, right? That's a kind of logic here. So commercial airliners are at a greater risk of becoming involved in mid-air collisions than our private planes. So what is the impact? Again, you need to understand that we are looking at the first statement only. We are not looking at the second statement, right? Because the question is specifically about the conclusion drawn in the first sentence. So do not think about the second sentence here. So this is the only thing that we are concerned with, that if we don't allow private planes not equipped with radar, most of the private plane traffic would be forced to use outlying airfields. What is the impact of D? That commercial airliners have a greater risk of being involved in mid-air collision than private planes? This is absolutely zero impact. Okay, because rather the first statement is not at all talking about mid-air collisions, right? We are just talking about that if we don't allow specific airplanes, which is private planes not equipped with radar, most of the private plane traffic would shift. So D has absolutely zero relevance to the first statement, which is what we are concerned with. But let's, for our discussion's sake, let's say instead the question 7, the conclusion or the argument above depends on which of the following assumptions, right? So let's consider the entire argument. So let's consider the second statement also. So now let's look at this. Commercial airliners are at greater risk. So these commercial airliners actually have a greater risk than private planes in terms of becoming involved in mid-air collisions. So what is the impact of this on the above argument? The argument is that we are going to reduce private plane traffic, and this reduction in private plane traffic will reduce the risk of mid-air collision, right? Now we get to know actually commercial airliners have a greater risk, right? So if the commercial airliners have a greater risk, what is the impact of that on the argument that we are going to reduce private plane traffic, so the risk of mid-air collisions around the centrally located airports would go down? That has no impact. Okay, why that has no impact? Because even if, so essentially what this indicates is that if you actually limit commercial airliners, if you don't allow commercial airliners, then you would reduce the risk even further, right? Option D indicates that actually instead of not allowing private planes, if you don't allow certain commercial airliners, you would do a better job at reducing the risk of mid-air collision, right? That's what it indicates, that because they are at a greater risk, commercial airliners are at a greater risk of being involved in mid-air collisions. That's fine. But it is not creating any doubt that if you reduce private plane traffic, that would reduce the risk of mid-air collision. The risk of mid-air collision would in any case go down with the reduction in private plane traffic. What this option is just saying is, oh, if the commercial airliners, the traffic of that goes down, the risk will further go down. That's fine. But it doesn't create a doubt on the statement that by reducing private plane traffic, you can reduce the risk of mid-air collision. You understand? It is just indicating a better plan, but it is not creating a doubt on our plan, which is a common mistake that we will make. Okay, so even if the argument as a whole is considered, this option still has no impact. Okay. Now let's look at option E. Okay, a reduction in the risk of mid-air collision would eventually lead to increases in commercial airline traffic. Okay, again, the first thing is to understand we are restricted to this statement, right? That if you have these restrictions in place that you don't allow the planes, private planes not equipped with the radar, most of the private plane traffic would be forced to use outlying airfields, and this reduction will reduce the risk of mid-air collision. Now option E is saying once the risk of mid-air collision goes down, that will lead to an increase in commercial airline traffic, which is fine. As long as most of the private plane traffic is forced to use outlying airfields, the argument is not impacted by increase or decrease in commercial airline traffic, right? The conclusion is that if you have these restrictions in place, most of the private plane traffic would be forced to use outlying airfields. Now, once these restrictions are in place, there is a reduction in risk of mid-air collision that leads to increase in commercial airline traffic. That has no impact because we are only concerned with most of the private plane traffic would be forced to use outlying airfields. So this option E has no impact on the first conclusion drawn in the first sentence. Okay? So now let's consider, let's think about it, that let's say we were talking about not just the first sentence, we were talking about the argument as a whole. Okay, so let's say the question stem were that the argument above depends on which of the following assumptions. And now it says a reduction in the risk of mid-air collision would eventually lead to increases in commercial airline traffic. Okay, now let's get back to the argument. The argument was we are not going to allow private planes not equipped with radar. That will mean most of the private plane traffic would be forced to use outlying airfields, and this will lead to a reduction in the amount of private plane traffic, and that would reduce the risk of mid-air collision around the centrally located airports. But now if there is a reduction in the risk of mid-air collision around the centrally located airports, and now we are seeing that will eventually lead to increases in commercial airline traffic. So you reduce the private plane traffic, and that reduces the risk of mid-air collision, and after the risk of mid-air collision goes down, the commercial airline traffic starts going up, right? This is how things are connected if you connect the argument with option E, right? So option E is talking about what happens once the goal is met, right? The goal was to reduce I'm very loosely using the word goal. So the eventual objective was to reduce the risk of mid-air collision around the centrally located airports, right? And what we were doing to achieve that goal is reducing the amount of private plane traffic. So reducing this traffic would reduce the risk of mid-air collision, right? This was the main thing there. Option E is talking about a thing which is after the objective has been met. That after the objective is met, eventually commercial airline traffic will pick up, right? So if that commercial airline traffic picks up, then perhaps there may still, again, the risk of mid-air collision may again go up, right? That's what can happen, right? But think about it. Our objective has been met already, right? And now the only concern is that, okay, whether the objective will continue to be met for a long period of time or not, because once the objective is met, which is the reduction in mid-air collision has happened, commercial airline traffic may start to go up, and then the objective may not continue to be met, because with the increase in commercial airline traffic, the risk of mid-air collision may start to go up. But for me, I don't think this option E will have an impact on the conclusion, because it's talking about a scenario once the objective has been met. So once the objective has been met, it has been met. Now whether it will continue to be met, uh, because there may be other changes, I don't think that has an impact on the argument. Okay, so even if I look at the argument as a whole, option E still has no impact. Okay, so that is my analysis of this question. I think the downside of or a thing that may not work for you is perhaps I spoke a lot and wrote only a little. But if you could go through the video and make sense of it, or make some sense of it, and you have some questions, please feel free to ask. The idea was to really dig deep into one question and all the options pertaining to that question, so that you can understand what really learning from a question, or what digging deep into a CR question means. Okay, I'm not sure how much successful I have been to communicate that, because again I can see that most of the time I was just speaking, not writing, so I'm not sure how much you will be able to catch. But I hope some of you will be able to understand and gain from this video. And if you have any questions, anything that is not clear, please feel free to ask. Thank you.